There was something deeply unsettling about the way he gripped the squeegee. It wasn't the relaxed grip of a man casually preparing to wash a window. It was the white-knuckled, paralyzed grip of a man standing completely dead still, holding a piece of aluminum because every single ounce of his cognitive bandwidth was violently hijacked by something else. His calloused fingers crushed the metal handle with a steady, terrifying pressure he didn't even realize he was applying. His eyes deadlocked onto the glass in front of him with the hyper-focused intensity of a man who isn't just looking at a room, but aggressively reading it. Inside the glass-walled boardroom, men in custom-tailored dark suits frantically gestured over a massive, phone book-sized contract, radiating the suffocating panic of billionaires who have an astronomical amount of cash on the table, and who are slowly realizing that money might be flowing in a catastrophic direction they hadn't anticipated. Outside, in the sterile 7th-floor corridor of the Imperial Vita Medical Center, a man in a cheap grey janitorial jumpsuit, his back stained with dark patches of honest sweat, stood paralyzed in front of the glass as if it were a portal into an alien dimension, which, in a very brutal way, it absolutely was. His behind-the-ear hearing aids had been running on completely dead batteries for 2 straight days. He knew the power was failing because the warning chime had pinged him late last week, but he had actively delayed swapping them out because fresh batteries cost money, the rent was due, and he had learned, over 28 grueling years of existence, that the audible world was merely a chaotic background track to the reality he actually inhabited, not the primary source of truth. The primary world was exactly what he saw. And what he saw, in that exact razor-sharp millisecond, were the lips of the Chinese venture capitalist sitting on the far left side of the massive mahogany table. The billionaire's mouth was moving with the highly specific, rigid articulation of Mandarin, language the janitor had taught himself to read over 3 agonizing years of obsessive, self-directed study. He had started learning it purely out of survival logic. The hospital had recently begun hosting endless waves of Asian investor delegations, flooding the corridors with complex documents and hushed hallway conversations, secrets that the rest of the minimum wage basement staff couldn't even begin to access. But that he, armed with the terrifying patience of a man who learns language through the precise geometry of human lips rather than sound waves, had methodically learned to decrypt. The investor's lips silently whispered to the slick assistant sitting right next to him, delivering a lethal string of data that hit the janitor's brain with the crystal clarity of a printed federal indictment. Asterisk, their corporate lawyer is an absolute moron. He completely missed the reverse dilution trap hidden on page 44. In exactly 36 months, we aggressively swallow the board of directors and kick this arrogant buffoon to the curb. We are going to bulldoze this hospital and pave it into a parking lot. Asterisk, his calloused hand aggressively tightened around the squeegee handle. His eyes did not flash with sudden, violent rage. They went completely dark, radiating the chilling, robotic focus of a man actively processing complex legal warfare. To truly understand the apocalyptic weight of what that translated sentence meant to him, we have to understand exactly who was standing on the other side of that reinforced glass, not the foreign investor, not the arrogant majority shareholder, but the young woman who, at that exact moment, the Imperial Vita Medical Center had been structurally engineered for a very specific, elite breed of human being. There was no physical plaque on the wall explicitly stating this. The violent exclusion was aggressively communicated through the architecture. The sprawling, imported Italian marble atrium felt vastly more like a 5-star luxury resort than a place of physical healing. The original, curated modern art hung in the VIP recovery wings. The gourmet, chef-crafted cafeteria menu featured exotic culinary options that practically required a translator for anyone who didn't routinely dine at Michelin-starred restaurants. It was the exact kind of hyper-exclusive ecosystem that exists in every major metropolis on Earth, a fortress that provides God-tier, miraculous care to anyone wealthy enough to swipe a black card while treating every single other human being especially the ghosts scrubbing the floors to keep the illusion alive. This is a cold, sterile distance of a ruling class that desperately needs the manual labor, but is physically disgusted by the laborers. Deep in the subterranean basement, the general services sector was a miserable labyrinth of unpainted cinder-block corridors where the suffocating stench of industrial bleach and floor wax violently mixed with cheap breakroom coffee and the sour sweat of human beings who stand on their feet for 12 agonizing hours a day. There was a rusted locker room with dented, numbered metal doors, a depressing cafeteria crammed with sticky formica tables, and a corkboard overflowing with mandatory overtime schedules and biohazard disposal protocols. That is exactly where the two siblings clocked in every single morning at 6 a.m. Beatrice had turned 32 exactly 3 weeks ago, and her 7-month pregnant belly had violently mutated her cheap, white cotton hospital uniform into a daily, agonizing struggle. The stiff waistband had originally been stitched for a flat stomach, and she had been forced to drop it off at a cheap neighborhood tailor to have elastic panels sewn in a pathetic $40 expense that had completely derailed her monthly budget, forcing her brother to skip buying his hearing aid batteries just to keep the lights on. Her dark brown hair was aggressively yanked back into a tight bun, but rogue damp strands clung to her forehead, glued by the exhaustion of the afternoon shift not due to sloppy grooming, but the brutal reality of a body that has been marching across hard floors for 8 straight hours, sweating out the neatness she had carefully pinned up at dawn. Her ugly, Velcro orthopedic sneakers had been specifically purchased on the urgent recommendation of a physical therapist she had seen through the hospital's garbage. Bare bones employee health planner pathetic policy that refused to cover actual specialists, but allowed a single PT consult if a general practitioner begged for it. The therapist had been crystal clear. Without the custom insoles, her spine would buckle under the baby's weight. She carried the heavy silver tray with the hyper-focused, terrifying attention of a woman who had learned the hard way that balancing hot liquids in a busy hospital corridor demands absolute, unbroken equilibrium, especially when your own body's center of gravity drastically shifts every single week. The tray held imported, loose-leaf green tea steeping in a delicate porcelain pot for the Asian delegates, a double shot of black espresso in a bone china cup for the arrogant majority shareholder, a specific brand of artisanal sesame biscuits explicitly demanded in a psychotic, bullet-pointed email sent by the executive assistant late last night. She knocked. It wasn't a loud, aggressive knock, it was the standard, muffled two-tap sequence drilled into her brain during hospitality compliance training. The exact submissive protocol required before breaching a VIP sanctuary. She nudged the heavy oak door open with her hip, exactly the way working-class women learn to navigate heavy doors when both their hands are full of rich people's food. And she stepped inside. The billionaire shareholder violently slammed his fist onto the mahogany table at the exact millisecond she crossed the threshold. The negotiation had hit its absolute nuclear boiling point. There was a highly complex financial clause actively being misinterpreted. The highly paid corporate interpreters were failing to translate the hostility accurately. There were billions of dollars bleeding out on the table, and the room was suffocating under the toxic pressure of a man who possessed so much wealth he genuinely believed that no other human variable in the room actually mattered. His arm swung out in a blind, violent gesture of pure, unadulterated rage. The heavy silver tray didn't stand a chance. Scalding. Near-boiling green tea violently splashed across Beatrice's exposed forearm long before her exhausted human reflexes could even attempt to dodge the impact. She let out a sharp, choked gasp that wasn't a full scream, it was the raw, involuntary sound of physical agony registering in the brain a split second before the nervous system can decide whether to bravely hide the pain or publicly surrender to it. Her hands instantly dropped the tray and aggressively clutched her swollen pregnant belly, executing the primal, biological instinct that bypasses all logic, desperately shielding the life growing inside her before even assessing the damage to her own burning skin. The shareholder violently shot up out of his leather executive chair. Marcus Vance was 54 years old, and over those 5 decades he had meticulously, aggressively constructed a flawless persona of terrifying dominance that functioned flawlessly in boardrooms where power was measured in bank accounts, and where every single sycophant surrounding him was paid a massive salary specifically to worship that dominance. His face was flushing a violent, apoplectic red, fueled by a toxic rage that had been boiling long before the tea spilled. A rage that had just found a much easier, much weaker target to obliterate than the frustrating contract clause on the desk. "You clumsy, useless piece of trash." His voice boomed across the boardroom, carrying the deafening volume of a man who isn't losing control, but is sadistically exercising what he genuinely believes is his God-given right to be that loud. "Are you totally blind? Can you not see we are in the middle of a multi-billion-dollar acquisition? Do you not know how to knock?" His manicured index finger aggressively jabbed the air, pointing directly at Beatrice's face with the lethal precision of a judge, issuing a death sentence without reviewing a single shred of evidence. "You low-class parasites genuinely think you can just barge in anywhere." And then his furious eyes snapped toward the glass wall, toward the cheap, sweat-stained, grey jumpsuit standing in the hallway, toward the eyes of her brother, still deadlocked onto the lips of the Chinese investor with the terrifying, unbroken focus of a supercomputer scanning raw data. "And what the hell is that retard doing out there?" His voice escalated into a manic, psychotic register, fueled by the specific kind of toxic rage that actively hunts for fresh meat once the first victim starts bleeding. "What the hell is he staring at? Are you deaf and dumb, or what? Get out of my damn sight." A devastating, heavy 1-second pause dropped over the room, allowing his absolute, pure disgust to find the most lethal combination of words available. "Go sweep the gutter where you belong. You too are a pathetic evolutionary glitch. Garbage like you shouldn't even be legally allowed to breed." His dead eyes ruthlessly dragged down to Beatrice's swollen pregnant belly, wearing the vile, sickened expression of a man evaluating a parasitic infection that had absolutely no business existing in his pristine, billion-dollar ecosystem. Beatrice stood completely paralyzed, her hands violently clutching her stomach, hot tears silently streaming down her flushed cheeks. It was a suffocating, heavy silence that wasn't born from an absence of a response, but from the absolute, crushing impossibility of generating one. There were entirely too many catastrophic things detonating inside her brain at the exact same millisecond. The agonizing, blistering burn melting the skin on her arm, the soul-crushing public humiliation, the terrified unborn child inside her who had spiked in heart rate, absorbing the violent tension of the room long before she could even process it herself. And buried underneath all of that was the desperate, burning need to scream something, anything, to defend her brother, who was currently being called a deaf, dumb retard through a pane of glass he couldn't even hear through. "Sir," her voice squeezed out of her throat, carrying the horrific, jagged tremor of a woman desperately trying to sound articulate while her central nervous system is actively managing third-degree burns, sheer panic, and absolute degradation all at once. "My brother, he didn't do anything wrong." On the other side of the glass wall, Kyle had seen absolutely everything. He had seen the heavy silver tray go flying. He had seen the boiling liquid splash across Beatrice's arm. He had seen her hands desperately grab her unborn baby. He had seen the arrogant, manicured finger violently pointing at his face through the acoustic glass. And he had stared dead at the billionaire's lips, reading the vile, unforgivable words forming in his mouth with the exact same terrifying, flawless clarity he had used to read the Chinese investor. Asterisk retard, deaf and dumb, gutter, evolutionary glitch, shouldn't even be allowed to breed. Asterisk his calloused fingers aggressively tightened around the aluminum mop handle, gripping it with enough violent pressure to dent the metal. But his eyes did not flash with a single ounce of blind, chaotic rage. They slowly, methodically returned carrying the chilling, robotic comm of an assassin who has a very specific job to finish locking right back onto the lips of the Chinese investor at the far end of the boardroom. The foreign billionaire was quietly observing Marcus Vance's psychotic meltdown with the dead, neutral expression of an apex predator evaluating a weakness in real time. He turned and whispered something incredibly fast to his assistant. A string of data that Kyle intercepted and captured with the absolute zero-point focus of a man who had learned early in life that the most apocalyptic truths are rarely broadcast over a loudspeaker. He read the lips. This arrogant fool doesn't even realize that in 36 months he won't have a single hospital left to sell. Clause 17.4 guarantees it. It's completely sickening to believe that a billionaire could stare at a pregnant woman with a severe burn melting her arm and only care about his own massive ego, isn't it? If you are also violently outraged by this level of sociopathic cruelty, smash that like button right now to prove you stand with Kyle and Beatrice against the elite. Kyle slowly placed the squeegee back into the yellow janitorial cart. He executed the motion with the smooth, calculated grace of a man putting away a tool he absolutely wouldn't need for the next phase of the operation, simply because the next phase required a vastly deadlier weapon. He ripped his cheap, cracked smartphone out of the chest pocket of his grey jumpsuit. He started typing. He wasn't drafting a comforting text to his crying sister, he was rapid-firing a message to a ruthless bulldog labor attorney who had represented a fellow basement janitor the previous year during a brutal, wrongful termination lawsuit. The lawyer's contact info had been permanently saved in his phone under a contact note that read, tells the absolute truth, charges whatever you can afford. The text message was fired off with the razor-sharp, lethal syntax of a man who has absolutely zero time for pleasantries, knows exactly what raw data needs to be transmitted. Clause 17. April Reverse Dilution. Page 44 Urgent Corporate Matter. I need to tell you exactly what I read today. He shoved the phone deep back into his pocket. Kyle grabbed a clean microfiber cloth off the cart. He went right back to polishing the outside of the glass wall, resuming his relentless, hypnotic rhythm. The precise, aggressive circular motion he had learned was the absolute most efficient way to strip grease off. Inside the screaming, chaotic boardroom, not a single billionaire in a tailored suit had realized that the most apocalyptic threat to their billion-dollar merger wasn't the complex financial trap the interpreter had failed to accurately translate. It was standing in the dead silence of the hallway, in the silence that had read absolutely everything. The subterranean first aid closet buried in the hospital's basement didn't have a single window. A harsh, flickering fluorescent bulb bolted to the drop ceiling cast the kind of sterile, blinding white glare reserved for spaces engineered purely for utility, actively discouraging any human being from wanting to linger. It held a cheap medical cot wrapped in crinkling sanitary paper, and a dented steel cabinet stocked with generic trauma supplies, organized with the cold logic of someone who uses the closet frequently enough to know exactly where the gauze needs to be. The air reeked of industrial antiseptic, violently mixed with the heavy, lingering scent of burn ointment that had hung stagnant in the unventilated air since the last time a ghost in the basement got hurt on the job. Beatrice was smearing the thick, cooling ointment across her blistered arm, wearing the hollow, exhausted expression of a woman actively managing physical agony that didn't even rank in the top 3 worst things happening to her that afternoon. The scalding green tea had left a furious, blistering red welt stretching aggressively from her wrist all the way up to her elbow. It wasn't straight line, mapped the chaotic, violent geometry of the accident, a splash pattern that possessed zero intent, but delivered catastrophic consequences. The ointment was freezing against her burning skin, and she applied it with her opposite hand, moving with the practiced, tragic care of a woman who intimately knew the medical protocol, because medical protocol was her daily grind. Kyle pushed the door open without knocking, not because he was reckless or disrespectful, because there was an invisible, unbreakable neurological link between them that completely bypassed the need for an audible warning. She snapped her eyes up the second the hinges creaked, and she instantly saw written across his face exactly what she had dreaded finding since she fled the boardroom. Since she had sprinted down the concrete stairwell to the basement, her arm screaming in pain. Her heart hammering wildly against her ribs, terrifyingly fast for a woman carrying a 7-month pregnancy. His hands instantly went airborne. American Sign Language possesses a raw, visceral quality that spoken languages rarely achieve. Pure, blinding urgency can be expressed without ever raising your voice, because the entire human body becomes the weapon, communicating explosive intensity without needing a single decibel of volume. Kyle's hands sliced through the sterile air with the aggressive, lethal precision of a man who uses ASL as his primary native language, not as a backup tool when his voice fails, but as the absolute, complete manifestation of his brilliant mind. Asterisk, he burned you. I am reporting him to the authorities. Asterisk, Beatrice stared down at her blistering, ruined arm. Then back up at her brother's furious eyes. Her own hands fired back, executing the frantic, blinding speed of deep biological familiarity, the rapid-fire velocity of two siblings who had spent their entire childhoods locked in a hostile world, aggressively building a shared, silent language purely as a survival mechanism against a society that was never designed to include them. Asterisk, no, he owns the building. We desperately need these jobs. The baby is coming. The health insurance. Let it go. Asterisk, there was something hidden deep inside the physical syntax of her sign for asterisk, let it go. Asterisk. That wasn't weak resignation, it was the agonizing, specific gesture of a woman begging someone she loves to stand down. It was the heartbreaking plea of someone who had already done the brutal math, calculating that the bloody cost of fighting back was infinitely higher than the reward. Fully aware that asking him to surrender directly violated every single fiber of his moral code. Kyle stood completely frozen for a heavy, agonizing second, his hands hovering dead in the sterile air right after her final sign. He dropped his eyes and stared at her severely burned arm. He slowly nodded his head. He executed the highly specific, rigid gesture of a man honoring a sister's desperate plea, while utterly refusing to accept a single ounce of the sick injustice that had forced her to make it in the first place. A massive, vital distinction between surrendering out of love and surrendering out of submission. And his burning eyes clearly broadcasted to her that it was absolutely the former, and never the latter. He spun around and walked out. He marched straight to the employee locker room, yanking open his dented, numbered metal locker, and ripped out the battered notebook he used to track his janitorial shift supply requisitions. Floor cleaning rotas, the pathetic, low-level administrative garbage that kept his week organized. He violently flipped to a blank page, gripping a cheap pen, and desperately tried to write down exactly what he had witnessed and intercepted in that boardroom. He moved with the frantic, terrifying urgency of a man who knows this radioactive intel needs to reach someone with the power to stop the bomb before the ink on the contract dries. His severe dyslexia arrived long before the actual words did. It was the specific, brutal strain of dyslexia that had plagued his deafness throughout his entire miserable run in the public school system. Not the dyslexia of a man who fails to comprehend complex thoughts, but the agonizing glitch of a genius who fully, brilliantly understands the matrix, yet hits a massive neurological brick wall the second he tries to translate those flawless thoughts into conventional written syntax. A barrier that simply did not exist when his hands flew in ASL or when his eyes decoded lips. The letters bled onto the cheap paper in whatever chaotic order they decided to arrive, some violently inverted, some aggressively swapped with others, complex financial words chopped into pieces at the wrong syllables. The grammar obeyed a rigid, internal logic that made flawless sense in his own brain, but looked like a psychotic, illiterate ransom note in standard written English. He reread the disastrous scrawl. He aggressively crossed it out and tried again. He finally managed to scramble together a crude, jagged paragraph that contained the raw radioactive data clause. Number, reverse dilution, page, contract asterisk, but it was trapped in a chaotic syntax that heavily relied on the reader's extreme goodwill to decipher. And Kyle had learned over 28 grueling years that human goodwill was a resource the world aggressively hoarded and rarely handed out to guys wearing grey jumpsuits. He folded the note and carried it straight to the hospital's in-house corporate counsel. The lawyer was a slick, exhausted suit in his early 40s, carrying the dead. Heavy eyes of a man juggling vastly more lawsuits than there are hours in a day. A man who had learned to ruthlessly triage every single piece of information that crossed his mahogany desk based purely on the physical appearance of whoever handed it to him, entirely ignoring the actual content. He looked up at the cheap, grey janitorial jumpsuit, then down at the crumpled, folded paper. Then at the chaotic, misspelled, backwards scrawl bleeding across the page. He glanced at it for exactly 2 seconds. He folded the paper back up. He casually tossed it into his mesh trash can, executing the mechanical, apathetic gesture of a man throwing away a useless takeout menu, completely discarding something that didn't fit into any pre-approved category of his billable hours. Just another psycho from the basement. The lawyer muttered the insult to the paralegal standing right next to him without even bothering to lower his voice, because his toxic arrogance calculated that there was absolutely no reason to hide his contempt from a deaf janitor. Kyle stood perfectly still outside the office, watching his arrogant lips form the vile words right through the glass wall. He read them perfectly. He turned on his heel and walked back into the marble hallway, matching the steady, calculated pace of an apex predator simply rerouting around a blocked path, rapidly calculating the next available tactical vector. The very next day, the majority shareholder signed the deal. He signed the lethal paperwork with the heavy, solid gold Mont Blanc pen he specifically hoarded in the breast pocket of his bespoke suit for moments of supreme arrogance, because he had learned decades ago that obscenely expensive instruments visually communicate the godlike weight of executive decisions. And the weight of this specific signature was the absolute climax he had been waiting his entire, ruthless life to execute. The financial consultants had frantically raised their red flags. It had been a grueling 3-week marathon of aggressive risk assessments, complex scenario projections, and highly technical legal warnings presented with as much clarity as humanly possible to a billionaire who had firmly decided he was going to pretend to listen and then blindly do exactly what he wanted to do anyway. "You people are way too damn conservative," his voice casually dismissed them with the blind, suicidal confidence of an arrogant man who had already decided he was the smartest guy in the room before the meeting even started. "This deal is the future of medicine. Sign the damn papers before the Asians get cold feet." The black ink glided across the contract with the buttery, flawless smoothness only obscenely expensive pens provide. Standing out in the hallway, looking right through the glass, Kyle watched the golden pen seal the man's fate. He flawlessly read the lips of the Chinese investor who shot his slick assistant a dark, predatory smirk, the exact, chilling smile of a wolf locking the slaughterhouse door from the outside, silently confirming the catastrophic trap he had mathematically predicted before his private jet even took off from Beijing. Asterisk it is done. Asterisk later that afternoon, the shareholder strutted down the main clinical corridor, radiating the smug, obnoxious posture of a titan who just secured the largest corporate buyout of his entire miserable life, desperately making sure the entire hospital felt his gravity. He spotted Beatrice stepping out of the service elevator with Kyle right beside her, the two siblings huddled together, her arms still heavily wrapped in fresh white gauze, his hands gripping the yellow janitorial cart. He stopped dead in his tracks. He stared at her employee ID badge, his face twisting into a sick, sadistic grin of recognition. The vile pleasure of a predator connecting the dots and realizing he gets to crush the exact same bug twice. You're the dummy's pregnant sister." He casually slid his iPhone out of his tailored pocket, aggressively scrolling through a spreadsheet as if the nuclear bomb he was about to drop was a minor administrative footnote. "You know what I just officially decided? To guarantee our new merger maintains its absolute standard of elite excellence, I'm completely outsourcing the custodial and support nursing staff. You're both fired, effective immediately. A vile, calculated pause to let the blade twist deep. And regarding your employee health insurance? Well, looks like you'll be delivering that kid down at the county Medicaid clinic. But hey, you people love rolling in poverty anyway. Beatrice stood completely paralyzed, her trembling hand instantly covering her swollen stomach. It was her ultimate defense mechanism, the instinctive, biological reflex that had hardwired itself into her brain over the last 7 months. Her hand flying to her unborn child whenever the outside world became too massive, too violent, as if the sheer physical contact could generate an invisible force field that the cruelty of billionaires couldn't penetrate. Kyle let go of the cleaning cart. His hands shot up into the space between them, fueled by an apocalyptic, blinding rage that had absolutely no physical outlet other than his entire body. The ASL sign slashed through the air with a terrifying, violent intensity. The kind of raw, unfiltered rage that is vastly more honest and lethal than screaming, because it weaponizes the entire human frame instead of just tearing up the throat. The shareholder glared at Kyle's flying hands, letting out a dark, booming laugh that had absolutely nothing to do with humor, and everything to do with pure, uncut sociopathy finding a target it could legally torture. Look at this freak. He looks like a monkey scratching off fleas. His vicious voice echoed down the pristine marble corridor, completely lacking the basic human decency to even attempt to lower his volume. Security? Drag this animal out of my hospital before he bleeds on my Italian marble. He fired a pregnant woman and violently humiliated a deaf man. But what the arrogant billionaire didn't realize was that the dummy was the absolute only person in the building who had cracked the contract. If you are hungry to see raw, ruthless justice arrive, smash that like button right now. The shareholder strutted away down the corridor, the gold Montblanc pen tucked in his pocket, the signed death warrant locked in his leather briefcase, totally consumed by the delusional certainty of a man who genuinely believes he is the untouchable hero of his own story. Kyle stood perfectly still until the echo of the billionaire's expensive shoes completely vanished. He slowly turned and looked at Beatrice. His hands began to move again, this time agonizingly slow, deliberate, carrying the terrifying ice cold calm that floods a genius's brain the second the red mist clears and the tactical pathway illuminates. Asterisk, this is not the end. I read the contract. I know exactly what is buried on page 40-4. Asterisk, Beatrice stared down at her heavily bandaged arm, then at her swollen belly, then up at her brother. She slowly nodded. Kyle pulled his cheap smartphone out of his pocket. He opened his text thread with the ruthless labor attorney, the one who told the brutal truth, and charged whatever you could afford, and aggressively added a new file to the desperate message he had fired off yesterday. This time, he didn't try to type a single dyslexic word. He propped the phone up, hit the front-facing camera, and recorded a blistering 1-minute ASL video. He aggressively signed every single piece of radioactive intel he had ripped out of that glass boardroom, executing the gestures with the flawless, terrifying precision of a man who wasn't struggling to recall a memory, but was directly printing a high-res photograph from his brain. The specific clause, the exact page number, the lethal Mandarin words the investor had whispered to his assistant, and the apocalyptic architectural trap the arrogant shareholder had blindly signed his own name to. He hit send. He shoved the phone back into his grey jumpsuit. He grabbed the handle of the yellow janitorial cart, and he continued pushing it down the marble hallway with his exact same steady, relentless stride, the unshakable march of a man who has a job to finish, and is going to finish it, because the work never stops, and because dropping to his knees and surrendering was absolutely not an available tactical option. The available tactical options were currently being rapidly processed by a bulldog labor attorney sitting in a cheap office across town. He had just received a 1-minute and 40-second ASL video message. He watched it 3 consecutive times, his jaw slowly dropping, before he violently grabbed his desk phone and dialed a senior colleague specializing in high-stakes corporate mergers. The labor lawyer spoke with the breathless, frantic tone of a man desperate to verify that he wasn't hallucinating frantically, explaining that a catastrophic reverse dilution clause had somehow miraculously slipped past an army of elite financial consultants, that the billionaire CEO had blindly signed it, and that he had a rock-solid eyewitness who had flawlessly read the foreign investor's lips, confirming the trap was highly intentional, and that the ultimate endgame in 36 months was a total hostile takeover of the board. His corporate colleague sat in dead silence on the other end of the line for 10 agonizing seconds. Then he whispered, "Send me the damn video right now." The hospital ID badge was still sitting deep in the pocket of Kyle's grey jumpsuit. He only realized he still had it when he got back to their cramped apartment on the night of the firing. Aggressively emptying his pockets onto his cheap mattress, his cracked phone, his house keys, and the plastic ID badge bearing a 2-year-old photograph where his hair was slightly longer, wearing the naive expression of a guy who hadn't yet survived the hell the next 24 months would drag him through. He stared blankly at the plastic card for a long second. He shoved it into his nightstand drawer. He didn't mail it back to HR, not because he forgot. It was a highly calculated tactical delay. The hospital's bloated HR department had officially processed their termination in the payroll system, which meant the ID badge was currently flagged as pending retrieval in the administrative queue. This meant it was trapped in a sluggish bureaucratic limbo. He knew the hospital's lazy IT security department notoriously took at least 48 hours to actually execute the digital kill switch on the physical RFID keycards. It was a window. A razor-thin, highly volatile window. But the door was still technically unlocked. He waited in the dark until 11 p.m. The luxury hospital operated on a vastly different neurological frequency at 11 o'clock at night. The massive, echoing main corridors were mostly deserted. The lazy shift change in the security booth generated a crucial 15-minute blind spot where the guards stopped looking at the cameras. The subterranean break rooms were dead empty, and the grey basement hallways reeked of highly concentrated industrial bleach, because the massive HVAC systems cycled differently on the night shift. This was the exact ecosystem. Kyle knew better than any living human being on the payroll he had spent to grueling years, mapping every single square inch of this fortress with the hypervigilant attention of a man who lacks the ability to hear approaching footsteps and therefore develops a terrifying, radar-like ability to read the physical space. The plastic badge beeped green on the side entrance card reader. He rode the humming freight elevator straight up to the executive 7th floor. The massive boardroom was submerged in darkness, the specific, ambient semi-darkness of high-rise corporate suites that feature floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, allowing the toxic orange and white light pollution of the metropolis to bleed through the glass. He slipped through the heavy oak doors, keeping his smartphone flashlight dialed down to its absolute dimmest setting. The industrial paper shredder was anchored in the far corner, right next to the locked mahogany filing cabinets. He had memorized the exact spatial coordinates of every single piece of furniture. In every single suite on the 7th floor during months of grueling, daily cleaning, a flawless mental 3D map that the human brain effortlessly constructs when a job is mind-numbingly repetitive, freeing up massive amounts of cognitive bandwidth to meticulously catalog everything the eyes touch. The expensive mesh trash can sitting right next to the shredder contained exactly what he mathematically prayed it would contain. The official merger contract had been executed with high-level digital signatures, a strict, paranoid cybersecurity protocol implemented specifically to guarantee that radioactive physical copies didn't float around outside the encrypted servers. But there is one glaring, fatal flaw about elite corporate lawyers trapped in high-stress billionaire negotiations. They always print hard copies. They print them, they scribble frantic, aggressive notes in the margins, and they toss them. Because paper is the physical battleground where a lawyer's raw, unpolished strategy takes shape before it gets sanitized into a sterile PDF, and the trash can is exactly where highly classified, unpolished thoughts go to die. The The paper was sitting right there in the mesh basket, crushed into a tight, violent ball, crumpled with the aggressive force of a lawyer desperately trying to destroy legibility in case an idiot janitor found it. But violently crushing paper doesn't magically erase laser printer toner. It just creates a chaotic, three-dimensional topography on the page that can easily be flattened out by a man with enough patience. Kyle shoved the crushed ball of paper deep into the pocket of the specific dark jumpsuit he had worn purely for this Black Ops run. He vanished back down the freight elevator, exiting the exact same way he broke in. Back at his apartment, his cramped bedroom was barely the size of a closet, violently carved out of the tiny living room by a cheap drywall partition he had installed himself. The second Beatrice found out she was pregnant and desperately needed her own space. He had bought the drywall panels on layaway from the corner hardware store, and had managed to frame it reasonably straight for a guy who learned carpentry by watching YouTube tutorials on his cracked phone with the closed captions turned on. His desk was the same miserable, chipped formica table he had used to do his homework since high school. The exact same desk where he had spent countless agonizing nights grinding through dense legal textbooks he borrowed from the public library, religiously renewing them every 7 days because those free books were the absolute only weapon he had access to that fit inside his non-existent budget. He slowly, methodically flattened the crushed paper against the formica with the palm of his hand, slowly, operating with the surgical patience of a man who intimately knows that crushed paper retains the brutal memory of its folds and that violently ripping it open destroys the data. You have to massage the memory out with constant, agonizingly gradual pressure. The frantic, scribbled margin notes became glaringly legible under the desk lamp. They were written in Mandarin, and a dark, heavy irony crashed into Kyle's chest. An irony he silently absorbed without signing a word to anyone. The brutal reality that the absolute only weapon that had trained him to decrypt these foreign scribbles was the exact same crushing, suffocating isolation that the rest of the world treated as his pathetic disability. He had taught himself Mandarin strictly by obsessively reading the lips of the elite foreign doctors, the visiting VIPs, and the Asian investors who strutted through the 7th floor. He learned it because aggressively learning everything was his survival mechanism, because without the luxury of background noise, his visual cortex absorbed 10 times more data, hunting for complex structural patterns in places where normal, hearing people never even bothered to look. The frantic scribbles perfectly confirmed exactly what his eyes had ripped off the investor's lips. But to truly, legally comprehend the apocalyptic weapon he now held in his hands, we have to understand what was actually printed in the heavy black toner of the document. Clause 17 April. It was draft highly toxic, predatory legal syntax specific to international corporate law, a ruthless dialect that deliberately utilizes labyrinthine phrasing to provide absolute clarity to the sharks who wrote it, while generating an impenetrable wall of confusion for the prey signing it. There was a very specific reason he had spent 3 years agonizing over contract law in the public library. It started 3 years ago when Beatrice had excitedly brought home her massive, impenetrable employee health insurance contract, dropping the dense stack of papers on the kitchen table with the exhausted, terrified expression of someone who knows their life depends on signing it but lacks the Ivy League vocabulary to navigate the minefield. He had sat down and read it with her line by line. He found toxic, predatory clauses buried in the fine print that absolutely did not mean what the bold headings claimed they meant. He had marched straight to the library the next day to decipher the poison. He never stopped going. He never stopped reading. His severe dyslexia made the reading process agonizingly slow, not impossible, just violently slow, demanding the brutal cognitive toll of rereading every single dense paragraph 3 times, because his brain would occasionally scramble the syntax on the first pass, requiring the second and third pass to force the letters into compliance. But he had weaponized that exact slowness, because reading at a microscopic, agonizing pace forces you to read infinitely more completely. It forces you to spot the tripwires that speed reading, arrogant billionaires blindly gloss over. He had spotted clause 17.4. He fully, mathematically understood the bomb. Reverse equity dilution. There was a highly complex, labyrinthine structure of brutal performance metrics hard-coded into the contract, established as the mandatory threshold the Asian hedge fund required to maintain their docile position as non-voting creditors. The trap was that the performance metrics had been aggressively calibrated with the surgical, sociopathic precision of assassins who knew damn well the targets were mathematically impossible to hit. Not impossible in the generic sense of a tough quarter, but technically, structurally impossible. The mandatory revenue parameters were violently untethered from reality, demanding profit margins that the private Brazilian healthcare market hadn't seen in over 12 years. When the hospital inevitably failed to hit the fabricated targets, and they absolutely would, because the math was rigged to guarantee failure, the Asian fund held the ironclad, unilateral right to aggressively convert their debt debentures into voting common stock at a catastrophic 90% discount off market value. The apocalyptic endgame was furiously scribbled in the lawyer's Mandarin margin notes with a simplicity that was, in itself, a breathtaking act of cruelty. In exactly 36 months, the arrogant majority shareholder would be violently stripped of his throne, plummeting from absolute controlling power to holding less than 6% of the company's bleeding shares. The hospital would be completely liquidated and shut down. The emergency room, the absolute only trauma center within a 50-mile radius that accepted low-income county Medicaid patients alongside the elite VIPs, surviving every corporate purge purely because it was a strict legal mandate of their city zoning concession, would be permanently boarded up. The state-of-the-art building would be gutted and flipped into luxury condos. Kyle sat frozen at his chipped formica desk, the flattened paper resting under his hands, taking a long heavy minute before he signed a single word. Beatrice walked into the cramped bedroom. Her swollen belly had noticeably dropped lower since last week, and she wore the hollow, haunted expression of a woman who was wide awake at 2 a.m. because the sheer, suffocating terror of losing her healthcare had permanently evicted her ability to sleep. Her hands moved through the dim light. Asterisk, are you actually going to hand that evidence over to him? After the evil garbage he did to us? Asterisk, she loaded her signs with an emotional weight that carried infinitely more than just the question. Her hands practically screamed about the agonizing burn blistered across her arm. The vital health insurance violently ripped away along with their paychecks, the unborn baby who would desperately need a pediatrician in less than 8 weeks, and the vile, unforgivable slur the billionaire had spat in the hallway about them not being allowed to breed. Kyle stared down at the laser-printed paper. Then he looked up at his sister. His hands fired back with the chilling, absolute serenity of a man who had taken the long, agonizing path to reach a conclusion, but had finally arrived at the absolute, undeniable truth. Asterisk, no. I am hand-delivering this bomb directly to the board of directors. They need to see the undeniable proof that their arrogant president is dangerously incompetent and just signed their entire empire away. This isn't petty revenge. This is corporate governance. Asterisk, Beatrice stood in the doorway, staring at him for a long, heavy moment. She wore the specific, processing expression that always hung between them when one sibling dropped a truth so massive that the other required a few seconds for their brain to fully download the file. It wasn't disagreement, it was simply the required processing time to grasp the sheer, apocalyptic blast radius of what he had just said. There was something profoundly, surgically precise in what Kyle had just signed that carried vastly more weight than if he had screamed it out loud. It was the vital, moral distinction that separates a man acting out of petty, bitter resentment from a man operating on an ironclad code of principle. That distinction bled through the physical language of his hands and his rigid posture with a flawless clarity that spoken words often fail to achieve. Because a voice can easily lie about a man's true intentions, but the human body rarely pulls it off. He wasn't trying to save the arrogant shareholder. He was going to save the hospital. He was going to save the emergency room. he was going to save, although he hadn't bothered to sign this specific fact. Because it was the unspoken gravity anchoring everything else, the employee health insurance that had been violently cancelled. The exact insurance that covered high-risk deliveries, the insurance Beatrice desperately needed in less than 2 months. He folded the laser-printed paper back up, moving with extreme care, this time not the violent, panicked crush of a lawyer trying to destroy evidence, but the meticulous, calculated fold of an archivist preserving a radioactive document. Finding the exact geometry that protected the paper without creasing the lethal Mandarin translations he needed the board to read. He slipped it into his pocket. He grabbed his cracked smartphone. He ruthlessly hunted down the name of the chairman of the board of directors for the Imperial Vita Medical Center on the SEC's public database, where the corporate compositions of publicly traded companies are legally mandated to be visible. He found the target in under 2 minutes, locking onto the chairman's direct, encrypted institutional email address buried deep in the investor relations directory. He opened his camera app. He hit record. He didn't type a single dyslexic word. He aggressively signed, staring dead into the front-facing lens, unloading every single catastrophic detail he had intercepted in clause 17.4. Every syllable he had ripped off the Chinese investor's lips, and the apocalyptic trap the margin notes confirmed. He delivered the intel with the terrifying, flawless precision of a man who wasn't summarizing a rumor, but projecting a high-res photograph straight from his brain, weaponizing the dense legal vocabulary he had bled for over 3 years in the public library. He attached the video file. He drafted one single line of text in the email body. He had Beatrice type it out, because her typing was infinitely faster and carried a more conventional corporate syntax than his stating absolutely nothing more than the fact that irrefutable material evidence of a hostile takeover was available for immediate verification, and that a rapidly closing window of time existed before the corporate damage became permanent and fatal. He hit send. He killed the desk lamp. He sat in the pitch-black bedroom, the folded contract resting on the formica, the dark screen of his phone sitting next to it, while the massive city outside his window did exactly what massive cities do at 3 a.m. It relentlessly kept grinding forward, operating with the cold, brutal indifference of a machine that doesn't need any one specific human being to keep the gears turning. The silence in the bedroom was the exact same heavy silence as always. The suffocating silence he had learned to conquer at 7 years old, when a violent bout of meningitis had permanently murdered his hearing, leaving him with absolutely everything else: the language, the flawless logic, the terrifying ability to instantly spot structural patterns in the chaos that normal, hearing people were entirely too distracted to notice. The silence that had violently forced him to learn how to read the deadly things people never actually say out loud. The silence that allowed him to crack clause 17.4. While a partner at an elite international law firm blindly chucked the blueprint into a mesh trash can, arrogantly calculating that a janitor couldn't possibly comprehend contract law. He finally went to sleep. On the other side of the cheap drywall partition, Beatrice lay wide awake for another hour, her hand resting protectively over her unborn baby, her eyes locked onto the water-stained ceiling, thinking about the little brother who had lost his hearing at 7 years old, and had ruthlessly taught himself to read lips in 5 different languages in the dead silence of a county library. Thinking about the multi-billion-dollar hospital that had, in its blind, arrogant greed, accidentally hired the absolute only human being within a 50-mile radius who possessed the exact, hyper-specific arsenal of skills required to decrypt the slaughter that was engineered inside that glass boardroom. She smiled in the dark, a tiny, razor-sharp smile. The kind that creeps across your face when you realize that the universe sometimes, very rarely, but sometimes arranges the chess pieces with a brutal, poetic justice that feels entirely intentional, even when it isn't. The board of directors' executive sanctuary was located on the 19th floor. It was the phantom floor that didn't even exist on the digital directory maps displayed inside the visitor elevators. Not because it was an illegal black site, but because there is absolutely no reason for a normal visitor to ever step foot there. And spaces that have zero reason to welcome the public tend to aggressively scrub themselves off the maps existing with the cold. Arrogant naturality of places that don't require signage. Because anyone who possesses enough power to be summoned there already knows exactly which buttons to push. The conference table was a massive, sweeping oval carved from a single slab of imported solid mahogany, finished with the kind of deep, blinding polish that aggressively communicates permanence. Not the cheap veneer of disposable tech startup furniture bought to last a few quarters, but the heavy, intimidating timber purchased with the terrifying intent that it will outlast the lifespans of the men sitting around it. There were 8 ergonomic leather chairs designated for the independent board members, a massive throne at the head of the table for the chairman, and one completely alien folding chair that had been deliberately placed at the opposite end by the chairman's explicit order earlier that morning, positioned so that whoever sat in it possessed a direct, unobstructed firing line down the entire length of the mahogany. The independent board members filed into the room wearing the hollow, panicked expressions of billionaires who had received a Priority 1 emergency summons at 2 a.m., had read the attached encrypted dossier before trying to sleep, and had spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling in sheer terror. The email had detonated in their inboxes exactly 48 hours prior to the meeting, bouncing from an encrypted, intraçable Proton mail server that the board's elite cybersecurity team had violently failed to crack. The subject line read, "In flawless English, asterisk clause 17, point for hostile acquisition risk analysis urgent, asterisk." The body of the email was a masterpiece of corporate warfare, drafted in perfectly mirrored English and Mandarin 2 parallel columns, each legally bulletproof in its respective language, anchored by a single, chilling footnote stating that the forensic analysis had been compiled by an operative possessing direct, physical access to the original, unredacted Chinese margin notes and unrecorded verbal communications from the private signing ceremony. 3 separate, elite international law firms had been put on retainer and ordered to tear the contract apart in 48 hours. All 3 firms came back with the exact same apocalyptic conclusion. Marcus Vance swaggered into the boardroom with his gold Mont Blanc pen clipped securely in his breast pocket, radiating the smug, arrogant posture of an apex predator who hadn't been fully briefed on the exact nature of the emergency agenda, but who possessed the blind, toxic confidence that he could easily manipulate his way out of whatever trivial mess had caused the panic, using the exact same bullying tactics he used to conquer everything else in his life. His predatory eyes rapidly swept the faces around the table, executing the lightning-fast tactical assessment he had sharpened over decades of hostile board meetings, hunting for his sycophants, mapping his enemies, and targeting the weak links he could bully into voting his way. He found 8 faces radiating an expression that didn't fit into any of his tactical categories. Total, icy hostility. The heavy oak doors clicked open again. Beatrice walked in first. She was wearing her standard-issue, cheap, white cotton hospital uniform. She chose it specifically for this morning because it was the exact same uniform she had bled in every single day for years, and because she had made the cold, calculated decision that she refused to wear a cheap blazer to impress them. The uniform was exactly what she was to this hospital, and she wanted the board to stare directly at the collateral damage they had inflicted on their own foundation. Her heavily bandaged, burned arm was glaringly visible beneath the short sleeve. She didn't flaunt it like a prop, nor did she attempt to hide it. It was simply present, radiating the raw, neutral gravity of a violent injury that doesn't require a dramatic speech to communicate exactly what kind of monster caused it. Her massive, 7-month pregnant belly entered the room right along with her. Right behind her walked Kyle. The cheap, grey General Services jumpsuit had been washed, but detergent doesn't alter the fundamental DNA of the fabric. It was the unmistakable, uniform of a ghost who breaks his back scrubbing the biohazard waste that billionaires refuse to touch, bearing the permanent, faded scuffs that industrial soap strips away but the polyester never forgets. His behind-the-ear hearing aid was firmly in place, but it was switched completely dead off. He had made that tactical decision at dawn. He had decided that inside this specific room, absolute, dead silence was the superior operating state. There was something profoundly poetic about absorbing this execution the exact same way he had absorbed every single piece of radioactive intel over the last 3 days strictly through his eyes. His eyes swept the massive mahogany table with the chilling, unshakable calm of an assassin who had finally reached the coordinates he needed to reach, and therefore had absolutely no reason to rush the kill. Marcus violently shot up from his chair. The blood rushed to his face with the blinding, explosive velocity of an apex predator's rage that suddenly finds its path blocked, immediately flooding his skin a dark, apoplectic red that started at his collar and violently crawled up his neck with the terrifying progression of a chemical fire he could no longer control. What the hell is this literal garbage doing in my boardroom? His voice boomed, instinctively deploying the deafening volume that had successfully terrorized the basement corridors, fully calculating that his sonic weapon would shatter the room. But his roar slammed into the boardroom's atmosphere and died instantly, swallowed by a vastly different breed of silence, the terrifying, heavy silence of billionaires who had been summoned to witness an execution and whose absolute focus could not be rattled by a screaming bully. Security. Drag these 2 filthy parasites out of my building right now. The chairman of the board slowly raised his hand. He was a 73-year-old titan who had secured his throne at the head of that table through a lifetime of ruthlessly executing the correct, bloody decisions with enough terrifying consistency that no one ever dared question his right to the chair. And packed inside the simple, quiet gesture of raising his hand was the specific, godlike authority of a man who absolutely never needs to raise his voice, because the room obeys the physical gesture before his hand even stops moving. Sit down, shareholder. The voice was barely above a whisper. It hit the room like a sonic boom. Marcus stood frozen for a humiliating, agonizing second, his brain's mechanical gears visibly grinding as he desperately tried to calculate if he still possessed enough leverage to openly defy the command, or if open rebellion was a tactical suicide. He read the 8 icy faces staring back at him. He realized his gun was empty. He slowly sank back into his chair. The chairman reached down and placed the crumpled, laser-printed paper dead center on the mahogany. It had been meticulously flattened, but the violent, deep creases from where the lawyer had crushed it remained permanently scarred into the paper. Right next to it, he placed the pristine, formal translation of the Mandarin margin notes that 3 elite international law firms had spent 48 hours frantically verifying. The only person who has the floor right now is this gentleman. The chairman's eyes locked onto Kyle, projecting the profound, specific respect of a man acknowledging that the cheap folding chair at the end of the table had been reserved for the deadliest person in the room. We received a highly classified translation of the Mandarin margin notes. It is utterly flawless. A heavy pause. It was cross-examined and forensically verified by 3 separate international legal teams. Another pause. The devastating, deliberate silence of a judge allowing the guillotine blade to hover before dropping it. Were you aware, Marcus, that clause 17.4 is a mathematically guaranteed hostile takeover trap? Marcus stared blankly at the crumpled paper, then at the chairman, then down the length of the table at Kyle. That is an absolute, fabricated lie. His voice completely lost its booming authority, cracking into the high-pitched, pathetic frequency of pure disbelief, trying desperately to masquerade as dominance, but utterly lacking the ammunition to make the illusion work. How the hell could he? He is stone deaf. He couldn't possibly have read a damn thing. There was something incredibly violently revealing in that pathetic defense something the 8 independent board members instantly registered and categorized in their own ruthless ways: the toxic, bigoted logic anchoring the sentence, effortlessly bridging deafness to total intellectual incompetence with the blind, arrogant ease of a man who had never been forced to question his own bigotry because his billions shielded him from the consequences of being an idiot. Kyle stared dead at him. He reached into his canvas backpack and pulled out his cheap, battered tableter low-end model wrapped in a thick, industrial rubber shot case he had bought purely to protect the glass, because he had learned the hard way that fragile screens shatter in heavy janitorial bags, and the ugly rubber case was the mathematically correct investment. He snapped the Bluetooth keyboard open. He started typing, not with the frantic, lightning-fast blur of a teenager who types without looking, but with the heavy, terrifying velocity of an executioner who possesses absolute, crystal clarity of exactly what the final sentence will be before his fingers even strike the keys hitting. Every single letter with the lethal precision of a man who isn't drafting a thought, but transcribing a flawless, loaded weapon that was already cocked in his brain. The chairman read the text appearing on the massive boardroom monitor out loud, executing the exact protocol they had agreed upon before the doors opened, broadcasting Kyle's words so the entire room absorbed the blast wave simultaneously. Asterisk, you literally just screamed, "Security? Drag these 2 filthy parasites out of my building." Your lips physically formed the word parasites while a sadistic smirk pulled at the left corner of your mouth. That is the legal definition of malicious contempt. You also stated, exactly 3 days ago, during the official signing ceremony, you people are way too damn conservative. You blindly signed the merger contract without bothering to read the certified translation that your own lead corporate counsel explicitly begged you to review via an urgent email sent the previous night at 1847 hours. Which is permanently logged in the hospital's internal server archives. This catastrophic negligence legally constitutes eventual malice, and is a flagrant, apocalyptic violation of an administrator's fiduciary duty under corporate fiduciary law. Section 153, asterisk. The suffocating silence that crushed the room after the chairman finished reading wasn't the silence of an empty void. It was the heavy, radioactive silence of total, absolute presence. 8 independent board members, the chairman, a pregnant nurse with a 3rd-degree burn, and a deaf janitor holding a cheap rubber tablet, all locked inside the exact same airspace, processing the exact same nuclear fallout. The only sound left in the room was the hum of the massive fuck system, churning out cold air with the blind indifference of a machine that doesn't care who just got slaughtered. Marcus stared blankly at his own shaking hands, at the gold Mont Blanc pen peeking out of his suit pocket, at the massive mahogany table that he had bought because he genuinely believed he would sit at it forever. There is a profound biological difference between the process of simply falling and the catastrophic process of collapsing. Falling is a rapid, involuntary trip on the pavement, but collapsing has a grueling, agonizing duration. It is the terrifying, slow-motion horror of the internal structural columns finally deciding they can no longer hold the roof up, and the human body slowly surrendering to gravity, sinking into the leather chair with the pathetic slowness of a man who has absolutely zero ammunition left to fight the pull of the earth. He collapsed back into his throne, ghostly pale. The chairman locked eyes with the independent members around the table, projecting the cold, synchronized stare of a firing squad confirming the execution order they had unanimously agreed upon long before the target even walked into the room. There was a rigid agenda. There was an ironclad legal protocol, and there was the absolute, unspoken understanding that this meeting wasn't convened to debate a solution. It was convened purely to formalize the slaughter that had already taken place in the shadows. I am officially calling for a vote. The chairman's voice was his standard. Icy baseline low, brutally functional, entirely stripped of any theatrical pageantry. For the immediate, catastrophic termination of Mr. Vance from his position as chairman of the board, and the total, unilateral annulment of the Asian merger citing severe vitiation of consent. Legally anchored by the gross, negligent malfeasance of the executing administrator, all in favor. 8 hands shot up into the air, simultaneously, carrying the terrifying, synchronized unanimity of a vote where the final verdict had been locked in stone long before the hands were raised. And the physical gesture was merely the bureaucratic theater required by law to carve the execution into the permanent corporate ledger. Kyle watched the manicured hands rise with the exact same hyper-focused stare he had weaponized in the 7th floor corridor, the piercing, unblinking eyes of a supercomputer logging critical data, absorbing the reality that the visual confirmation he was currently capturing would be permanently burned into his hard drive with flawless fidelity. He placed the cheap rubber tablet face down on the mahogany table. He looked across the room at Beatrice. His hands moved a tiny, microscopic gesture. The highly specific, intimate sign they used between themselves for the massive things that absolutely did not require verbal elaboration. A sign that had carried a dozen different, heavy meanings over their grueling lifetime together, but in this exact, explosive millisecond, meant only one thing. It is done. Beatrice gently rested her hand on her swollen belly. She nodded. The heavy, echoing thud of the security guard's boots marching down the marble corridor carried the terrifying rhythm of an inevitable funeral march. Marcus Vance stumbled out of the boardroom, his posture radiating the pathetic, hollow shell of a man desperately trying to physically project an aura of power that had just been violently surgically extracted from his spine. His bespoke suit jacket was still buttoned. His silk tie was still perfectly knotted. The gold Montblanc pen was still anchored in his pocket. But the structural integrity of his shoulders had completely caved in, violently buckling in a way that expensive Italian tailoring could never hide. Because it wasn't the fabric that had broken. The marble corridor of the 19th floor terminated at a bank of brushed steel VIP elevators. Beatrice and Kyle were standing right next to the doors. They hadn't been ordered to stand there by the chairman. They had walked out of the boardroom seconds before the execution concluded, anchoring themselves in the hallway because there was one final, necessary transaction that had to occur on this marble floor before the elevator doors opened and the hospital's vertical architecture separated them back into vastly different stratospheres, the way gravity always separates the gods from the ghosts. Marcus stopped dead in his tracks. He stared at Beatrice, first his dead eyes tracing the heavy white bandages on her arm, the massive swell of her pregnant belly, and the cheap plastic employee ID badge she was still stubbornly wearing pinned to her uniform. Because the bureaucratic nightmare of her formal termination hadn't officially processed yet, and she had made the ironclad decision to wear it until someone physically ripped it off her chest. Then, he slowly shifted his eyes to Kyle. There was something the broken billionaire desperately wanted to say, a sick, burning need to vomit words into the marble corridor that might somehow magically rewind the clock, or aggressively reorganize the catastrophic slaughter that had just occurred in the boardroom. A pathetic, delusional urge to exercise the exact same toxic, godlike control over this quiet hallway that he had exercised over every single other moment of his miserable life. The voice completely failed to materialize. Not because his throat was physically paralyzed, it was a catastrophic psychological roadblock. The horrifying, real-time realization of a narcissist discovering that there is absolutely no combination of arrogant words in the English dictionary capable of fixing the apocalypse he caused. And his voice, which had spent 50 years learning to only speak when it possessed the leverage to crush the listener, simply decided to shut down. Kyle stared right back at him. His eyes were completely empty of rage. They were his standard, terrifying baseline, the eyes that processed. The eyes that cracked codes. The eyes that had stared right through the acoustic glass on the 7th floor with the lethal focus of a genius executing a flawless surgical strike that absolutely no one in the building even realized was happening. his hands slashed through the air. Beatrice watched her brother's hands with the hyper-focused attention of a woman receiving a decrypted transmission in a native language that was as vital as oxygen. She slowly turned her head, locked eyes with Marcus, and translated the signs out loud for the entire 19th floor marble corridor to absorb, for the heavily armed security guard to hear, for the slick executive assistant escorting the perp walk to hear, for the entire architectural footprint of the hospital to hear with the terrifying clarity of a truth spoken in a space with flawless acoustics. He said, "Silence has a voice, too. And my brother just used his to slit your throat." The brushed steel elevator doors slid open. Marcus stumbled inside. The heavy doors glided shut with the soft, hydraulic whisper of flawlessly engineered mechanics, a sound that is almost dead silence, but isn't quite. And there was something profoundly, beautifully poetic about that specific mechanical whisper being the absolute final sound of their collision. What happened next was built with the terrifying velocity of massive corporations that make catastrophic mistakes at light speed, but when forced to pivot to save their own lives, execute the correct decisions with the exact same violent speed, because survival doesn't care about the direction of the panic. The formal reinstatement was processed by HR in under 48 hours. It wasn't just a generic reinstatement, it was the massive structural course correction that detonates when a billion-dollar institution realizes they just committed a sin massive enough to require vastly more than an apology. It required a total architectural rebuild. The newly crowned board of directors spent 3 agonizing days locked in an emergency marathon session, flanked by independent auditors, external crisis consultants, and elite corporate governance specialists, operating with the terrified urgency of men frantically redesigning an airplane mid-flight before the engines exploded again. The Department of Corporate Compliance and Accessibility was officially chartered, and affirmative pejorative PR stunted weaponized. It was gifted a massive independent operational budget, granted absolute unilateral authority to report directly to the board, and armed with the teeth that make the vital difference between a hollow HR title that exists to look good on a brochure and a loaded gun that exists to execute predators. Kyle received the official job offer via his cheap rubber tablet. The chairman of the board had personally typed the encrypted email directly to him, operating with the profound, hard-earned respect of a billionaire who had learned in 48 hours that there are highly effective ways to communicate with a genius that don't require a sign language interpreter. Provided you are smart enough to use the correct channel, he accepted. Not immediately, he fired back a list of demands. He typed the ironclad stipulations with the exact same lethal, dyslexic precision he typed everything else, demanding absolute operational autonomy, unredacted access to all C-suite architectural documents, and a frictionless reporting protocol. He demanded this because he had learned the hard way that corporate titles invented for the ghosts the system previously ignored are usually hollow traps designed to project the illusion of inclusion while deliberately withholding the actual keys to the vault. The chairman's replies were flawlessly satisfactory. His new executive office was custom engineered to the exact specifications he had brutally outlined: a massive, ultra-wide screen monitor bank running real-time, AI-generated closed captioning software specifically hardwired into the room's acoustics, a dedicated, on-call ASL interpreter permanently retained for any high-level negotiation involving more than 3 suits. The ambient lighting was surgically recalibrated by an architectural firm to eliminate glare, guaranteeing flawless lip-reading visibility from every single angle of the mahogany desk. The heavy brass plaque was bolted to his door on a Thursday morning. * Special Director of Multilingual Contractual Risk and Compliance. * The tailored navy blue clinical coat was a highly symbolic gesture from the new board, officially recognizing his operational status as dead equal to the elite medical chiefs. It was hand-delivered, folded perfectly inside a glossy box sitting right next to his brand new RFID chipped ID badge. The new badge featured a high-res, updated photograph capturing the hardened victorious face he wore today, alongside his actual name, followed by the unprecedented executive title that had been literally invented from scratch to define the god-tier weapon he was. He put the blue coat on. He slotted the brand new, hyper-advanced hearing aid into his earpad in cash using the massive signing bonus from his new executive contract. It was equipped with military-grade acoustic technology that he hadn't been able to afford for 21 agonizing years. When he powered it on, the sweeping spectrum of frequencies physically flooded his auditory canal with the concussive force of an ocean wave. It wasn't just the sheer volume of the noise, it was the terrifying, three-dimensional volume of a world that had been screaming right next to him his entire life, crashing into his brain with a blinding HD clarity that required him to sit perfectly still for a heavy minute just to process the sensory overload. He sat in the ergonomic leather chair of his new office for a long, silent moment before booting up his monitors for his first official day, wearing the crisp blue coat, the $1 million hearing aid, staring past the brass plaque on his door, looking out the massive floor-to-ceiling glass window. Not the rotting cinderblock sub-basement. He was on the 12th floor, possessing a sprawling, godlike view of the absolute best side of the skyscraper overlooking the lush green expanse of the city park. And beyond that, the jagged, chaotic, bleeding skyline of a metropolis that had violently grown out of the dirt without ever asking a single billionaire for permission to exist. The state-of-the-art humanized maternity wing was officially ribbon-cut exactly 6 weeks later. It was fully funded by a massive chunk of the capital explicitly salvaged from the annaled Asian merger colossal 8-figure sum that had originally been earmarked as a toxic advisory fee for the offshore cartel. When the contract was violently voided, the cash was instantly repatriated into the hospital's operational vault, waiting for the new board to dictate its destiny. The board had unanimously voted to greenlight the maternity ward in their very first session, rubber-stamping the budget before they even looked at the rest of the agenda. Beatrice gave birth on a Tuesday morning. The grueling labor lasted 11 agonizing hours, but they were 11 hours of a profoundly, fundamentally different nature than any hour she had ever spent suffering inside that hospital. Not the traumatizing, invisible hours carrying heavy silver trays down marble corridors. Not the panicked, blinding agony inside the windowless basement first aid closet. These were 11 hours that belonged entirely, fiercely to her, surrounded by an elite, hyper-specialized medical team who had been explicitly trained to ensure that those hours were hers to command. The ambient lighting, the soft acousticum, the ambient room temperature, everything was flawlessly calibrated so that the absolute most important collision of her entire life had the perfect, sacred ecosystem to detonate inside. The baby boy arrived at exactly 11:43 a.m., unleashing the chaotic, furious screaming that newborns project right before their brains register that the freezing, blinding world outside is vastly different from the safe, muffled world inside. And then he fell completely silent, his tiny eyes scanning the room, wearing the stunned expression of a brand new human violently processing a massive data dump. Kyle held his newborn nephew for the very first time with the exact same heavily calloused arms that had hauled toxic bleach buckets, pushed heavy aluminum squeegees, and dragged the crushing, invisible weight of his own existence for 28 grueling years. He felt a profound, heavy gravity in his hands that was vastly different from anything he had ever held, the terrifying, fragile weight of a tiny human being standing at the absolute beginning of the timeline, born safely inside a hospital that had almost been violently paved into a parking lot. He whispered. His voice broke the silence, carrying the exact same raw acoustic quality it had retained since he was 7 years old, not the sterile, artificially modulated voice beaten into deaf children by relentless speech therapy, not the strained, exhausting vocalization of a man desperately trying to prove to the hearing world that he isn't broken. It was the raw, unpolished, slightly nasal resonance of a man who plays an instrument without ever hearing the music he's producing. It was For that exact, beautiful reason, the sweetest sound in the room. I am going to teach you how to actually listen, he whispered, staring down at the tiny face. And how to see the monsters that everyone else is too blind to notice. The baby slowly opened his eyes. Now I'm asking you, in your absolute honest opinion, what was the catastrophic, fatal flaw that destroyed the arrogant shareholder, the blinding greed that made him sign a trap without reading it, or the toxic bigotry of underestimating the deaf janitor? Drop your brutal truth in the comments. I need to know your take. Across the sprawling city, locked inside a sterile, ultra-luxury penthouse that had been purchased back during an era when his limitless cash flow justified any psychotic impulse buy, Marcus Vance sat staring at his massive flat-screen TV. He gripped the remote control, the volume dialed down to a pathetic whisper, because he had learned the hard way that blasting the volume inside an empty, cavernous penthouse only amplifies the suffocating desperation of the man living there. And his shattered ego was still violently resisting broadcasting how completely destroyed he actually was. The financial news segment was broadcasting live footage from the hospital's main auditorium, a massive acoustic theater that had been totally gutted and renovated as the flagship project of the new board's aggressive corporate governance overhaul. The ceiling was rigged with a military-grade, real-time closed captioning projection array, and a highly paid ASL interpreter was permanently anchored to the left of the podium, hard-coded as the mandatory baseline protocol for every single corporate event in the building. Kyle was standing dead center on the stage, wearing the tailored navy blue clinical coat, the hyper-advanced hearing aid, and using his flying hands to deliver the keynote address to a packed audience of elite hospital executives, healthcare administrators, and regional medical directors who had flown in from 3 different states just to study the revolutionary compliance architecture he had built. An architecture erected from the ashes of a scandal that had violently dominated the front pages of every financial journal in the country, running under the blistering, legendary headline the Wall Street editors had unanimously agreed upon. Asterisk the janitor who read the fine print. Asterisk Marcus hit the power button. The screen went black. He sat in the suffocating silence of his multi-million-dollar tomb, staring down at the glass coffee table where the heavy, solid gold Mont Blanc pen rested, the exact same golden weapon he had used to blindly sign his own death warrant, wielding the toxic delusion of a man who genuinely believed that sheer arrogance was a valid substitute for actual due diligence. He slowly picked it up. He pressed the nib against a blank notepad. Attempting to scribble something there wasn't a specific, profound thought he needed to document. It was just the pathetic, muscle memory reflex of a man grabbing the golden scepter that had defined his entire god complex. An object that had successfully masqueraded as a symbol of his invincibility for vastly longer than it ever deserved to. The black ink didn't flow. He aggressively pressed harder, digging the gold nib into the paper. Absolutely nothing. He stared down at the dead pen, his face contorting as his brain processed the horrific, poetic metaphor that the universe hadn't asked his permission to deliver, but was violently forcing down his throat anyway. The heavy, gold-plated weapon that had executed the biggest, bloodiest deal of his life, completely bone-dry, empty, utterly incapable of writing a single, relevant word ever again. He violently hurled it against the wall. The gold pen smashed against the imported Italian marble with the sharp, pathetic crack of a useless object reaching the absolute end of its lifespan. It bounced off the wall and dropped dead onto the floor, landing right next to the shredded, crumpled remains of the merger contract he had frantically printed out months ago to reread exactly what trap he had signed, violently tearing it to pieces the second his brain finally comprehended the apocalyptic scope of the slaughter he had blindly authorized. If there had been a security camera inside the penthouse, the frozen frame would have perfectly captured the dead gold pen resting on the marble next to the shredded paper, the flawless, tragic still life of a brutal trajectory that had launched with absolute, unchecked arrogance and terminated on the cold floor of a silent, empty cage. But there was no camera, There was only the heavy, suffocating silence. The exact same heavy silence that had hung in the 7th floor corridor when a man in a cheap grey jumpsuit had read the lethal truth off a billionaire's lips right through the reinforced glass, the silence that had heard absolutely everything. This story proves that true apocalyptic power does not live in the loudest scream. It lives in the quietest, deadliest stare. It proves that there are ghosts walking among us whom the world arrogantly chooses to ignore, forcing them to develop the terrifying ability to see the monsters the rest of the world is too blind to notice. And that underestimating a human being purely based on how they navigate the world is the most catastrophic, fatal error a billionaire's ego can ever make. If you crave raw stories of brutal justice and undeniable survival that rip your heart out and force you to see the world differently, smash subscribe and ring the bell to join our family.